The Galactic Concordia space station had never seen a disaster of this scale. Fire, something most species in the galaxy had long conquered, raged uncontrollably through the central power core. An experimental energy source, designed to revolutionize space travel, had malfunctioned, igniting an inferno that no automated suppression system could contain. The station's walls trembled as explosions erupted, sending waves of heat and smoke billowing through the corridors. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows as terrified aliens scrambled in every direction, their fear amplified by the sheer unfamiliarity of the situation. Species with scales, fur, and even bioluminescent skin huddled together, their voices a cacophony of panic. None of them had ever faced fire like this before. None of them knew what to do. Jake Carter stood among them, the only human aboard, his gaze locked on the heart of the blaze. Unlike the others, he didn't freeze. He didn't retreat. His mind wasn't overwhelmed by fear, but sharpened by years of training. He had seen worse on Earth, skyscrapers collapsing in flames, forests engulfed in firestorms, lives hanging in the balance. This was just another fire, just another challenge to overcome. His hands tightened into fists as he turned toward the alien emergency crew, their multi-eyed, multi-limbed forms paralyzed by indecision. "We need to act now," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Where's the main control for the fire suppression system?" But the response was only more hesitation. The station's technology was advanced, but no one had ever accounted for a fire of this magnitude. The automated systems had failed, and no one, not the engineers, not the security teams, had the instincts to handle it. Jake didn't waste another second. He sprinted toward the blaze, his fire-resistant suit absorbing the worst of the heat as he moved with practiced efficiency. The air shimmered around him, waves of unbearable heat distorting his vision, but he pushed forward. His oxygen tank hissed as he took controlled breaths, forcing himself to stay calm. Firefighting wasn't just about putting out flames, it was about controlling fear, about thinking clearly when everything around you screamed disaster. He reached a corridor where the fire raged like a living beast, roaring as it consumed everything in its path. The metal walls groaned, warping from the extreme temperatures, and the floor beneath him vibrated with distant detonations. He activated the manual suppression valve, but nothing happened. The station's systems were completely unresponsive. If the fire reached the reactor core, it would trigger a catastrophic explosion, tearing the station apart and killing everyone aboard. Behind him, a group of aliens watched in shock. They were scientists, engineers, diplomats, beings from across the galaxy, all frozen by the sight of a lone human standing where none of them dared. Their species had evolved without fire as a natural threat. They had never faced burning forests, collapsing buildings, or suffocating smoke. To them, this wasn't just dangerous, it was inconceivable. Yet there he was, moving with purpose, unaffected by the paralyzing fear that gripped them. One of the engineers, a reptilian being with emerald scales, stammered, "Human. You cannot survive this. The heat will kill you." Jake shot him a look, adjusting his gear. "Not if I put it out first." He needed another way to control the fire. His mind raced, filtering through every lesson learned from the infernos back on Earth. Water was useless, too dangerous near an energy reactor. Foam suppression wouldn't be enough at this scale. Then it hit him: oxygen. Fire needed oxygen to survive, and if he could isolate the affected sections, he could suffocate it before it reached the core. He turned to the nearest alien. "Can you override the ventilation system? Shut off oxygen to these decks?" The alien hesitated before nodding rapidly, hands moving over a holo display. I can try." "Then do it. Now." As the alien worked, Jake moved deeper into the danger zone. His suit's heat resistance was failing. He could feel the scorch of superheated air against his skin, sweat pouring down his back. His oxygen gauge blinked a warning, but he ignored it. The fire lashed out, a monster hungry for destruction, but he didn't falter. He reached the power core's emergency override panel and, with shaking hands, began shutting down auxiliary systems, rerouting energy away from the overheating mainframe. The metal beneath his fingers was burning hot, but he kept going. If he stopped, If he failed, the entire station would be lost. A sudden, violent explosion rocked the station, sending him sprawling. The oxygen cutoff had worked, but a secondary blast had ruptured the floor plating. Pain flared through his side, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. The fire was weakening now, its life force stolen by the lack of air. He could see it dying, flickering, struggling. Relief washed over him, but he didn't allow himself to stop. Not yet. He activated the emergency coolant system, and with a final, deafening hiss, the last of the flames vanished into thick, swirling steam. Silence followed. Smoke curled around him, the air heavy with the scent of burned metal and scorched wiring. He turned, facing the group of wide-eyed aliens who had watched the impossible unfold. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief and something else, respect. For the first time, they understood what it meant to be human. Not just physically, but mentally. Humans didn't freeze. Humans didn't run. When disaster struck, humans fought back. Jake exhaled, his breath raspy through the rebreather. "Fire's out," he said simply. The words carried through the comms, and within moments, the station's emergency alerts shifted to all clear status. The danger was over. The station was safe. As he stepped forward, the crowd parted, eyes still fixed on him. The reptilian engineer who had doubted him before finally spoke, voice filled with awe. "I have never seen anything like that before." Jake smirked, shaking the sweat from his hair. "Yeah, well, it's just another day on the job." And with that, the legend of the human firefighter spread across the stars. Smoke thickened inside the galactic Concordia space station, turning the air into a suffocating, acrid cloud. The power core chamber, once a pristine hub of advanced technology, was now a scene of chaos. Emergency sirens wailed through the corridors, red lights flashing in a desperate warning. The fire that had erupted in the previous hours had not only refused to die, but had spread further, creeping toward the unstable energy core. Engineers and security officers from various alien species scrambled in confusion, their voices overlapping in panic as they tried and failed to contain the disaster. The station's automatic safety systems had been overwhelmed, and now the situation was spiraling into the worst possible outcome. If the core overheated and exploded, the entire station would be wiped out, along with every life aboard. Most of the station's inhabitants had already been evacuated. Amidst the terror and indecision, one figure still moved with purpose: Jake Carter, the human firefighter. His suit, made from Earth's toughest heat-resistant materials, was already scorched from his earlier battle against the flames, but he didn't slow down. His breathing was heavy, oxygen levels running low, but his mind was sharp, focused on only one goal: stopping the fire before it reached the reactor. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the soot that stained his skin. His gloved hands gripped the fire suppression hose tightly as he advanced, braving the searing heat that made the metal walls glow like embers. Around him, the alien emergency crew hesitated. Most of them had never seen such a blaze before. Their species had never evolved with fire as a natural threat. They had the technology, but not the courage. That was something only the human possessed. A towering alien officer with dark, chitinous armor-like skin stepped forward, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Human, this is madness," he rasped through his translator device. "The fire cannot be stopped. The core will breach. We must flee." Jake didn't even look back as he connected a manual coolant hose to the emergency line. "You can run if you want. I'm staying." The alien hesitated, his massive form casting a shadow in the flickering light. "You do not understand," he said. "Our calculations predict a 97% chance of total destruction. The logical choice is to evacuate while there is still time." Jake finally turned, his eyes fierce, unwavering. "And what about the 3%? The alien faltered, uncertain how to answer. But Jake wasn't. He had fought too many fires in his life to believe in surrender. He had seen infernos that swallowed entire forests, blazes that turned cities into molten ruins, but he had never given up. It wasn't in his nature. Fire was relentless, but so was he. The heat clawed at him, smoke burning his throat, but he kept moving, forcing the flames back, inch by inch. The aliens watched in stunned silence as he did what none of them dared to do. For a moment, he was alone in the fight, but then something shifted. One of the engineers, a small, insectoid being with too many limbs, scurried forward and activated a secondary suppression unit. Another officer, previously frozen in fear, rushed to assist with the coolant valves. The sight of the human refusing to back down was enough to push them into action. The battle against the fire was brutal. The station groaned under the stress of the spreading flames, metal twisting from the unbearable heat. Jake's arms ached as he fought against the raging inferno, his suit's warning sensors flashing red, but he refused to retreat. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he had no time for weakness. He adjusted his stance, aiming the coolant spray at the reactor's overheating support columns, trying to buy more time. A sudden explosion rocked the chamber, sending a shockwave that nearly knocked him off his feet. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. The fire was growing desperate now, like a wounded beast striking out in its final moments. But he had fought too long, given too much to let it win. With a final burst of effort, he activated the last emergency containment measure, sealing off the reactor's lower vents and cutting off the oxygen supply in the most dangerous sections. The flames flickered, weakened, and then, slowly, began to die. Steam hissed as the last remnants of fire were suffocated, leaving behind only the eerie glow of molten metal and the acrid scent of burnt wiring. The silence that followed was deafening. The aliens, still in shock, stared at the wreckage. The fire was out. The station had survived. And standing in the center of the destruction, covered in soot and sweat, breathing heavily through his damaged rebreather, was the human who refused to back down. The alien officer who had doubted him earlier approached cautiously, his multifaceted eyes reflecting something close to admiration. "You are an anomaly," he said slowly. "No other species would have stayed. No other being would have fought until the end." Jake exhaled, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. He pulled off his damaged helmet, shaking out his sweat-soaked hair. "Yeah, well," he muttered, his voice hoarse but steady. "That's just what we do." Word of his actions spread across the station, then beyond, traveling through the galaxy like wildfire. Stories were told of the human who had faced down an unstoppable inferno and won. Of the species that did not surrender, no matter the odds. And as the Galactic Concordia's emergency systems finally stabilized, the aliens who had once looked at humans with curiosity now looked at them with something else. Respect. The emergency sirens blared across the Galactic Concordia space station, their shrill alarms echoing through the vast corridors. Red warning lights flashed against metallic walls, casting eerie shadows as terrified aliens scrambled in all directions. The station's central reactor and advanced fusion core, designed to power the entire facility, was on the verge of catastrophic meltdown. The explosion wouldn't just destroy the station, it would send a shockwave strong enough to wipe out the orbital colonies nearby. Engineers from dozens of species worked frantically at control panels, their hands trembling as they tried and failed to override the failure. Panic spread like wildfire as it became painfully clear that nothing in their database could stop what was coming. There was no protocol for this, no solution, no hope. But then, through the chaos, a voice cut through the noise. "Move!" Jake Carter, the only human aboard, pushed his way past the panicked engineers and scanned the readouts. His expression was calm, focused, even as the countdown timer above the reactor displayed a terrifying reality: 10 minutes until meltdown. The alien scientists, their many eyes and strange appendages frozen in terror, turned to look at him. None of them had ever witnessed a human in crisis before. They had heard stories, of course, tales of the stubborn, reckless species that thrived in chaos. But now, seeing one in action, they could hardly believe it. Jake's fingers danced across the emergency interface, overriding safety locks with practiced precision. "The cooling systems have failed," he muttered, his voice tense but steady. "If we don't vent the heat manually, this whole place is going up in flames." An avian-like alien beside him, its feathers twitching in distress, stammered, But the venting protocols are locked out. We have no way to release the pressure. Jake didn't even glance up. Then we unlock them. His mind worked at lightning speed, filtering through every experience, every lesson he had learned from a lifetime of emergency responses back on Earth. Fires, reactor leaks, collapses, he had faced it all. And he had survived. Because humans didn't wait for solutions. They made them. His eyes flicked to the reactor chamber's schematic, searching for anything that could be used to delay the inevitable. And then he saw it. A maintenance tunnel running beneath the main coolant tanks, leading directly to the emergency release valves. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. Without hesitation, he turned to the group of wide-eyed aliens. "I need a pressure suit and manual override tools. Now." The station commander, a towering reptilian being with gleaming emerald scales, shook his head. "Human, that tunnel is flooded with radiation. You'll be dead before you reach the valves." Jake exhaled sharply, tightening the straps on his fire-resistant gear. "Better me than all of us." The aliens exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. They didn't understand. To them, self-sacrifice was an anomaly. The idea of willingly stepping into danger when escape was an option was unfathomable. But for humans, it was instinct. With only 7 minutes left on the countdown, Jake grabbed the tools and sprinted toward the maintenance hatch. The heat from the reactor core pulsed through the walls, making every breath feel like inhaling fire, but he kept going. His boots clanged against the metal rungs as he descended into the dimly lit tunnel. The radiation alarms blared, warning him of lethal exposure, but he ignored them. His only focus was reaching the valve controls before time ran out. His body screamed in protest, sweat drenching his back as he forced himself forward. The walls vibrated violently, the reactor groaning as it inched closer to detonation. He could feel the raw energy building, a silent promise of destruction waiting to be unleashed. 5 minutes. Reaching the emergency valve, he dropped to his knees and pried open the rusted control panel. The station had never needed to use this system before it was old. His hands moved with precision, detaching burnt-out fuses and rerouting the power flow. His suit's radiation meter blinked furiously, warning of exposure levels that should have been fatal. But he pushed the thought aside. He wasn't dead yet. And as long as he was breathing, he could still fight. He gritted his teeth, gripping the manual override lever. It was jammed. Of course it was. 3 minutes. He exhaled, forcing every ounce of strength into his arms. His muscles burned as he pulled with everything he had. The metal groaned, resisting him, but he refused to let go. Somewhere above, the alien crew listened in horrified silence to his labored breathing over the comms. They could hear every grunt, every struggle. The avian scientist whispered, "He's not going to make it." The reptilian commander clenched his jaw. Then why is he still trying? 2 minutes. With a final roar of effort, Jake yanked the lever down. A deafening hiss filled the chamber as the emergency vents sprang to life, releasing a torrent of superheated steam into space. The reactor's temperature gauge dropped instantly, stabilizing just seconds before the critical threshold. The countdown timer flickered, then stopped. Meltdown averted. Above, the control room erupted into stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. They had been seconds from death, from annihilation. And one human had stopped it. The radio crackled. "Someone get me a damn cold drink," Jake's voice rasped through the comms, exhaustion lacing every word. A beat of silence, and then laughter relieved, shaken but genuine. When Jake finally emerged from the tunnel, suit damaged. Stares not of disbelief, but of something far greater. Awe. Respect. Even fear. The reptilian commander stepped forward, towering over him. "I do not understand your kind," he admitted, voice low. "You risked your life when logic dictated otherwise." "Why?" Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, breathing heavily. "Because if there's a way to win, we take it. No matter the odds." Word of what had happened spread beyond the station, across the galaxy. Stories of the human who had faced certain death and refused to surrender. And for the first time, the universe truly understood what made humans different. It wasn't their technology, their strength, or their numbers. It was their will. When the clock was ticking, when all hope seemed lost, humans didn't back down. They ran toward the fight. And they won. The battle in the HFY system was supposed to be over before it even began. The Zirak Dominion, a warlike alien empire, had already destroyed dozens of fleets in their ruthless campaign of conquest. Their ships were massive, armed with planet-shattering weapons, and protected by energy barriers so advanced that no known species had ever managed to breach them. The Galactic Coalition, a fragile alliance of many civilizations, had tried to resist, but every strategy had failed. Their fleets were torn apart, their colonies burned, and now, the last line of defense stood in orbit around Kepler 9, a major coalition stronghold. The Zirak Armada was closing in, and with them came the certainty of annihilation. The coalition leaders had already begun evacuation plans, preparing to surrender the system before suffering yet another humiliating defeat. But then came Captain Daniel Hayes, the human who refused to accept the inevitable. He stood on the bridge of the USS Dauntless, his gaze locked on the holographic battle map, as the enemy fleet approached like a wave of death. Around him, his crew, a mix of humans and aliens, waited for orders, their faces tense with fear. They had all seen the reports. The Zirak were invincible. Their shields absorbed everything. Their weapons crushed anything in their path. Fighting them was suicide. But Hayes wasn't interested in statistics. He was interested in winning. "We're not retreating," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The alien tactical officer, a Vrelian with shimmering blue skin, cleared his throat. "Sir, the fleet commanders have deemed this battle unwinnable. We are outgunned, outnumbered," and Hayes raised a hand, silencing him. "I didn't ask what they thought. I asked how we can break those shields." The science officer, a reptilian Zenari, shook his head. "Their barriers absorb energy and kinetic force. No known weapon has ever penetrated them. Even direct nuclear detonations have failed to cause damage." Hayes exhaled, rubbing his chin. The Zirak were powerful, yes, but not perfect. Every weapon, every defense had a weakness. You just had to find it. And if no one else had, then he would. He turned to his engineers. "Run a deep scan of their shield harmonics. Look for instability, even the smallest fluctuation. If they have a weakness, we'll exploit it." The Zirak fleet began their attack. Enormous beams of raw energy lanced through the void, tearing through coalition ships as if they were paper. Explosions flared in the darkness, entire battleships vanishing in blinding fireballs. The Dauntless swerved through the chaos, dodging blasts by mere meters as its defense system struggled to hold. "We can't keep this up," the pilot yelled. "Shields down to 30%. Hayes didn't flinch. "Keep moving. Give me those readings." Then, suddenly, the Zenari science officer's eyes widened. "Captain! Their shields. They have a cycling frequency. Every 30 seconds, there's a 0.2-second window where their defense grid resets." Hayes's mind raced. 0.2 seconds. That wasn't an opportunity, it was a miracle. No normal weapon system could exploit such a small opening. But he wasn't looking for normal. He was looking for the impossible. He turned to his weapons officer. "Load the railgun with a tungsten penetrator. Full velocity." The officer blinked in confusion. "Sir, that won't do anything to their shields," Hayes grinned. "Not if we fire at the wrong time." The enemy flagship, a colossal Zirak dreadnought, loomed in the distance. It was the core of their invasion force, the command hub that directed the entire assault. If Hayes could take it down, the fleet would collapse into disarray. He watched the battle clock, waiting, counting. 25 seconds. 26, 27. His grip tightened on his chair. "Stand by." 29. The Zirak commander, watching from his flagship, scoffed at the human vessel's pathetic resistance. Another worthless insect fighting a war it cannot win, he growled. But then, something unexpected happened. Fire. The Dauntless's railgun roared, launching a tungsten slug at an unimaginable speed. It ripped through space like a silent storm, invisible to the naked eye. And in that precise moment, the 0.2-second window, the Zirac shields reset. The slug hit. For the first time in history, a Zirac battleship screamed. The impact was devastating, tearing through the dreadnought's armored hull and shattering its command center in an explosion so powerful that debris scattered across the battlefield. The entire Zirac fleet froze as their flagship broke apart, flames and wreckage spilling into space. On the Dauntless, stunned silence filled the bridge. The officer stared at the screen, watching the impossible unfold. Hayes exhaled, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Told you they weren't invincible. Chaos erupted among the Zirac ranks. Without their command ship, the fleet's formation crumbled. Coalition forces, emboldened by the sight of their greatest enemy falling, launched a counterattack. Within minutes, what had been certain defeat turned into an unthinkable victory. The Zirac ships, once arrogant and untouchable, now fled. Their belief in their own superiority shattered. As the battle ended, the coalition leaders sent transmissions of shock and gratitude. No one had believed it was possible. No one but a single human captain who refused to accept defeat. Standing on the bridge, watching the remnants of the Zirac fleet retreat into deep space, Captain Hayes simply crossed his arms and said, "They'll be back. But next time, they'll know humans don't lose easily." And across the galaxy, stories of the impossible feat spread like wildfire. Stories of the species that found victory where none existed. The species that never backed down. The towering buildings of Orion Prime, a massive space station that housed millions from various alien species, stood against the endless void of space. It was a city of metal and glass, its corridors always filled with the hum of trade, politics, and daily life. But today, there was no hum, only the wailing of emergency sirens, the desperate cries for help, and the roar of a raging inferno. A catastrophic explosion had torn through Sector 12, one of the busiest commercial hubs of the station. A fuel storage unit had ruptured, igniting a firestorm that spread faster than anyone could react. The station's automatic suppression systems had failed. The emergency response teams, composed of various alien species, were paralyzed with fear. The fire was unlike anything they had encountered before, consuming everything in its path, feeding off the oxygen supply and growing into a monster of flame and destruction. Amid the chaos, while others hesitated, one figure moved forward. Jake Callahan, the only human firefighter stationed on Orion Prime, tightened his heat-resistant suit and adjusted his helmet. His oxygen mask hissed as it sealed over his face. His comm buzzed with frantic messages from the station's command center. "Human, fall back. The fire is uncontrollable," warned Commander Exiron, a six-limbed reptilian officer overseeing the disaster response. "You'll be incinerated." Jake's grip on his plasma extinguisher tightened. "Not if I stop it first." Without waiting for permission, he charged into the inferno. The heat was unbearable, hotter than any Earth fire he had ever fought. The flames in space behaved differently. They didn't flicker, they twisted and curled, moving like living creatures. Superheated metal groaned as structures collapsed around him, sending sparks and debris in all directions. His suit's sensors screamed danger, warning of failing oxygen levels, toxic fumes, and heat beyond safe limits. But he kept going. Through the thick smoke, he saw dozens of trapped civilians, aliens of all shapes and sizes, huddled in a corner, unable to escape. Some had collapsed, overcome by the fumes, their bodies barely moving. Others clung to each other in silent terror, their alien physiology unable to withstand the extreme temperatures. They had minutes left. Jake didn't hesitate. He activated his thermal scanner, searching for the weakest point in the fire's spread. He spotted it, a reinforced access tunnel that led to an emergency exit. If he could clear a path, they had a chance. His comm crackled again. "Jake, the fire's too strong," shouted Leora, an avian-like medic who had fought alongside him in past rescues. "You'll never get them out in time." Jake took a deep breath, ignoring the fear in her voice. "Then I'll make time." He switched his plasma extinguisher to maximum output and unleashed a wave of coolant mist, pushing the fire back just enough to create a narrow passage. The moment the flames weakened, he ran forward, grabbing the nearest unconscious victim, a feline-like alien with delicate fur now singed by the heat. He carried them toward the exit, his muscles screaming under the weight, and then ran back for the next one. Again and again, he went back, ignoring the fire licking at his suit, ignoring the burning sensation creeping into his skin. The fire fought back. A sudden explosion rocked the corridor, throwing him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his ribs. His oxygen supply blinked critical. The fire closed in again, hungry and relentless. The civilians screamed. For the first time, doubt crept into Jake's mind. Maybe this was it. Maybe the fire had finally won. But then, in the darkness, he heard a small voice, a child's voice. One of the young aliens, barely older than a human toddler, was crying. Something ignited inside Jake, not fear, not panic, but pure, unshakable determination. He forced himself to stand. His breath was ragged, his body exhausted, but he wasn't done yet. He grabbed the child first, shielding them with his own body as he sprinted through the blaze. Behind him, the fire roared, as if furious that he had dared to resist. One by one, he pulled the civilians through the passage. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he never stopped. He couldn't stop. And then fresh air. The exit door slammed shut behind them. The station's secondary air filtration system whooshed to life, extinguishing the remaining embers clinging to his suit. The civilians gasped, some collapsing in relief, others staring at him in silent disbelief. They had seen heroes before, but never like this. Never someone who ran into the fire, not away from it. Never someone who treated death as just another opponent to fight and defeat. The station's fire crews finally arrived, their equipment now functional, their resolve strengthened after witnessing what one lone human had accomplished. They quickly secured the area, taking over containment efforts. The fire, once unstoppable, was now under control. Commander Xiron approached Jake, his reptilian face unreadable. "You should be dead," he said, not as an insult, but as a statement of fact. "No one survives a fire like that." Jake, still catching his breath, removed his helmet, revealing sweat-drenched hair and a tired but defiant grin. "Guess I didn't get the memo." The news of his actions spread like wildfire, ironic, considering the circumstances. Across Orion Prime and beyond, the legend of the human firefighter grew. People whispered his name in awe. His actions were studied by alien emergency teams. Some called him reckless. Others called him insane. But most called him something else. Hero. And deep down, Jake didn't care about the fame or the titles. He only cared about one thing, that in the face of fire, in the face of death itself, he had done what humans did best. He had refused to back down.